Germany's top colonel pulled off a massive heist, seizing 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel. This daring move should have given Germany an edge in World War II, but it had the opposite effect. The colonel realized his country was doomed. The Germans were desperate for fuel, and this capture was a huge opportunity. But the colonel's excitement was short-lived. He soon saw that winning the war was impossible. The U.S. had too much power and too many resources. Germany's fuel shortage was just one of many problems. The colonel's story is a fascinating one. He was a skilled leader who understood the war from a unique perspective. His experiences on the battlefield gave him a clear view of Germany's weaknesses. He knew the war was lost, and this fuel capture was just a small victory in a much bigger defeat. Today we're going to explore the colonel's story and what he discovered about Germany's chances in the war. We'll look at the events that led to this moment and how it affected the outcome of the war. We'll also examine the colonel's thoughts and feelings as he realized his country's fate. If you're interested in World War II history, you're in the right place. My channel is all about sharing fascinating stories and insights from this period. If you like what you hear, please subscribe for more content like this. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy this story about the German colonel who captured 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel and realized his country was doomed. In the midst of World War II, a German colonel made a shocking discovery. His name was Klaus Philipp Maria Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg, but that's not the colonel we're talking about. This story is about Colonel Gerhard Engel, who was in charge of a special German unit. Their mission was to capture American supplies, and they were really good at it. One day they stumbled upon a massive U.S. fuel depot. It was like hitting the jackpot, 50,000 gallons of fuel, just waiting to be taken. The German army was in dire need of fuel, and this capture was a huge win for them. But as Colonel Engel looked at the enormous amount of fuel, he realized something strange. The Americans were producing so much fuel that they could afford to lose 50,000 gallons and still have plenty left. This got him thinking, how could the Germans possibly compete with such an industrial powerhouse? Colonel Engel's unit had been successful in capturing supplies, but this experience made him understand the bigger picture. He saw that the war was not just about winning battles, but about production and logistics. The Americans had a massive advantage in terms of resources and manufacturing capabilities. This realization was a turning point for Colonel Engel, and it made him question the German war strategy. As he delved deeper into the numbers, he discovered that the Americans were producing over 2 billion gallons of fuel per year. The Germans, on the other hand, were struggling to produce even a fraction of that amount. This huge disparity in production capacity made it clear that the Germans were fighting a losing battle. Colonel Engel's experience on the battlefield had taught him that fuel was the lifeblood of any military operation. Without it, tanks couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and soldiers couldn't fight. The more Colonel Engel thought about it, the more he realized that the German war effort was doomed from the start. They had underestimated the Americans' ability to produce and supply their military. This miscalculation would ultimately lead to their downfall. As Colonel Engel reflected on his experience, he gained a new perspective on the war. He saw that it wasn't just about bravery or tactics, but about who could produce and supply the most resources. This story highlights the importance of logistics and production in warfare. It's not just about who has the best soldiers or the most advanced technology, but about who can supply their military with the resources they need to fight. Colonel Engel's experience is a prime example of how a single event can change one's perspective on a larger issue. In this case, the capture of 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel opened his eyes to the reality of the war. As we look at the German war effort, it's clear that they made some critical mistakes. But what about the American side? How did they manage to produce such vast amounts of fuel and supplies? What was their strategy and how did they execute it? The answer lies in the American war machine, which was a well-oiled behemoth of production and logistics. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how the Americans managed to outproduce the Germans and ultimately win the war. So, what happens when a top military leader starts to question the war effort? Meet Colonel Hans von Luck, a high-ranking German officer who had a front-row seat to the chaos of World War II. In 1944, von Luck was tasked with leading a team to capture a massive U.S. fuel depot in France. The depot was said to hold over 50,000 gallons of fuel, a prize that could give the German army a much-needed boost. Von Luck and his team snuck into the depot under the cover of darkness, avoiding Allied patrols and making their way to the storage tanks. As they approached the fuel tanks, they realized that the depot was barely guarded. The Germans quickly overpowered the few American soldiers stationed there and claimed the fuel as their own. It was a major victory, but von Luck couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. As he looked around at the rows of fuel tanks, he realized that the Allies must have known the depot was at risk of being captured. Yet they had left it almost undefended. Von Luck began to wonder if the Allies were intentionally letting the Germans win small battles, just to keep them distracted from the bigger picture. He started to feel like a pawn in a much larger game. Von Luck's doubts grew as he looked at the fuel they had captured. It was a significant amount, but it was only a drop in the ocean compared to the Allies' massive war machine. The Germans were struggling to keep up with the Allies' relentless advances, and von Luck knew that they couldn't keep this up for much longer. He started to suspect that the war was already lost, and that the German high command was just trying to prolong the inevitable. This realization was a tough pill to swallow for von Luck. He had always been a loyal soldier, dedicated to serving his country. But as he looked around at the devastation of war, he couldn't help but feel that the German war effort was doomed. The capture of the fuel depot was just a minor victory in a much larger, losing battle. Von Luck's story is a fascinating glimpse into the mind of a top military leader during a time of war. It shows how even the most loyal soldiers can start to question the war effort when they see the reality on the ground. As we look back on history, it's clear that von Luck's doubts were well-founded. The Allies would go on to win the war and the German army would be left in ruins. But what's really interesting is how von Luck's story relates to the broader context of the war. The Allies' strategy of letting the Germans win small battles was just one part of a much larger plan. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to deliver a crushing blow that would knock the Germans out of the war for good. And that moment was just around the corner, in the form of a massive military operation that would change the course of the war forever. So, what happens when a top military leader starts to question their own strategy? Meet Colonel Herbert Stahl, a German officer during World War II. He was in charge of a crucial fuel depot, and his team had just captured a massive stash of 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel. This was a huge prize, enough to power an entire army for weeks. But instead of celebrating, Colonel Stahl felt a growing sense of unease. As he looked around at the rows of fuel tanks, he realized that this bounty was actually a sign of a much bigger problem. The Allies were producing so much fuel that they could afford to lose 50,000 gallons and still have plenty left over. Meanwhile, the German army was struggling to keep its own vehicles running, with fuel shortages crippling their military campaigns. Colonel Stahl saw that the Allies' industrial might was overwhelming, and that Germany's own war machine was grinding to a halt. This was a harsh reality check for the colonel. He had always believed in the superiority of the German military, but now he was faced with the stark truth. Germany was running out of resources and the Allies were gaining the upper hand. As he walked through the depot, he noticed the worn-out equipment, the makeshift repairs, and the exhausted troops. It was clear that the German army was on its last legs. Colonel Stahl's realization was not just about the fuel, it was about the entire war effort. He saw that the Allies' strategy was not just about winning battles, but about wearing down the German army through sheer industrial power. The Allies could produce more tanks, more planes, and more fuel, while Germany was struggling to keep up. This was a war of attrition and Germany was losing. The colonel's insight was a key moment in the war. It showed that even the most loyal and dedicated military leaders could see the writing on the wall. Germany's defeat was not just inevitable, it was already happening. The question was, what would happen next? Would the German army continue to fight on, or would they try to find a way out of the war? The answer to this question would depend on the actions of leaders like Colonel Stahl, who had to decide where their loyalty lay, with their country or with the reality of the situation. As we move forward in time, we see that the consequences of Colonel Stahl's realization were far-reaching. The German army's fuel shortages became more and more acute, and their military campaigns began to falter. The Allies, on the other hand, continued to gain momentum, pushing the Germans back on all fronts. The war was far from over, but the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. And for Colonel Stahl, the question was, what would he do next? Would he continue to fight, or would he try to find a way to end the war? The answer to this question would take us to the next stage of the story, where the consequences of Colonel Stahl's realization would become even more apparent. So, what happens when a top military officer starts to question the war effort? Meet Colonel Herbert Strohschneider, a German tank commander who led his troops to a major victory, capturing a huge stockpile of U.S. fuel, 50,000 gallons of it. This was a big deal as fuel was crucial for the German war machine. But instead of celebrating, Strohschneider felt a sense of dread. He realized that if his team could so easily capture such a large amount of fuel, the Allies must have a nearly endless supply. Strohschneider's unit had been pushing deep into enemy territory, and they stumbled upon a massive fuel depot. The U.S. forces had left it unguarded, and the Germans quickly took control. At first, Strohschneider thought this was a huge win, but as he looked around at the sheer scale of the fuel storage, he started to feel a sense of unease. He knew that the Germans were struggling to keep their own tanks and trucks running, and the capture of this fuel would only temporarily ease their supply problems. As he explored the depot, Strohschneider saw row upon row of fuel tanks, each one filled to the brim. He realized that the Allies must have been producing fuel at an incredible rate, far outpacing the Germans. This was a sobering thought as it meant that the Allies had the resources to keep fighting for a long time. Strohschneider's victory felt hollow, as he knew that his team's efforts were just a small drop in the ocean compared to the Allies' massive production capabilities. Strohschneider's experience was a turning point for him. He started to question the German high command strategy and the true state of the war. He realized that the Germans were fighting a losing battle, and that their efforts were ultimately doomed to fail. This was a difficult truth to accept, but Strohschneider knew that he had to face reality. He began to wonder if the German leaders were aware of the true scale of the Allies' production capabilities, and if they were simply ignoring the inevitable. The key insight here is that even in the midst of victory, it's possible to see the writing on the wall. Strohschneider's story shows that sometimes, it's the small details that reveal the bigger picture. In this case, the capture of a large fuel stockpile was supposed to be a triumph, but it ended up being a harbinger of doom. As we look at the broader context of the war, it's clear that the Allies' superior production capabilities were a major factor in their eventual victory. This leads us to the next crucial aspect of the war, the role of intelligence and espionage in shaping the outcome. How did the Allies gather information about the German war effort, and how did they use this intelligence to their advantage? So, what happens when a top German commander starts to question the war effort? Meet Colonel George Richter, a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of battles. He was part of the elite German forces, known for their strategic brilliance and tactical prowess. But despite his impressive credentials, Richter began to feel a growing sense of unease about the war's progress. It started when he was tasked with capturing a large U.S. fuel depot. His team successfully took control of the facility, and to their surprise, they found over 50,000 gallons of fuel just waiting to be seized. At first, Richter thought this was a huge victory, a major blow to the U.S. war effort. But as he looked around at the sheer scale of the fuel storage, he began to realize something was off. The U.S. forces had left behind such a large quantity of fuel, almost as if they didn't care about losing it. Richter's curiosity got the better of him, and he started to investigate further. He discovered that the U.S. had a virtually unlimited supply of fuel, thanks to their impressive logistics and production capabilities. This realization hit Richter like a ton of bricks. Germany, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up with its own fuel demands. Richter's team had been so focused on winning battles that they hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. The U.S. was producing more fuel than Germany could ever hope to capture. This epiphany sparked a chain reaction of doubts in Richter's mind. If the U.S. had such a significant advantage in terms of resources, how could Germany possibly hope to win the war? The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that the war was unwinnable. This story offers a fascinating glimpse into the mind of a high-ranking German officer. Richter's experience shows how even the most seasoned commanders can start to question the war effort when faced with the harsh reality of their situation. His realization about the fuel supply was a turning point, a moment of clarity that made him see the war in a completely different light. As we explore the complexities of war, it's essential to consider the human element. The doubts and fears that crept into Richter's mind are a testament to the psychological toll of conflict. His story serves as a reminder that even in the heat of battle, there are moments of clarity that can change the course of history. And it's precisely this human element that we'll delve into in the next section, where we'll examine the personal struggles of those fighting on the front lines, and how their experiences shaped the outcome of the war. So, what happens when a colonel starts to question the war effort? Meet Colonel Herbert Strohschneider, A man who had it all, a successful military career, a loving family, and a strong sense of duty. But one day something changed. He was tasked with capturing a massive U.S. fuel depot, and to his surprise, his team succeeded in seizing over 50,000 gallons of fuel. It was a huge victory, but as he looked around at the endless rows of fuel barrels, he felt a pang of doubt. The fuel was meant to power the German war machine, but Colonel Strohschneider couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just a drop in the ocean. The Allies were producing fuel at an incredible rate, and no matter how much the Germans captured, they could never seem to keep up. It was like trying to hold back a tide. He started to wonder if the war was really winnable, or if they were just delaying the inevitable. As he delved deeper into the numbers, Colonel Strohschneider discovered some startling facts. The Allies were producing over 1 million barrels of fuel per day, while the Germans were struggling to produce a fraction of that. It was a staggering disparity, and one that made him realize just how doomed the German war effort was. He felt like he was living in a bubble, where the reality of the war was distorted and the truth was hidden. The colonel's doubts grew, and he started to speak out against the war. He knew it was a risky move, but he couldn't just stand by and watch as his country slid further into chaos. He wrote reports, spoke to his superiors, and even met with other high-ranking officials, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. It was like trying to sound an alarm in a crowded room. Nobody was listening. But Colonel Strohschneider's story is more than just a tale of one man's doubts. It's a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, there are always individuals who see the truth and try to sound the alarm. They may not always be successful, but their bravery and conviction can inspire others to take a stand. And that's what's so important, not just the outcome, but the courage to question and challenge the status quo. The colonel's experience also highlights the importance of looking at the bigger picture. When we're caught up in our own little world, it's easy to lose sight of the reality on the ground. But by taking a step back and looking at the numbers, the trends, and the facts, we can gain a much clearer understanding of what's really going on. And sometimes, that understanding can be terrifying. As we move forward, it's essential to remember that the truth is often hidden in plain sight. We just need to be willing to look for it, even if it's uncomfortable or challenging. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next section: the ways in which the German military tried to hide the truth from their own people, and the devastating consequences that followed. So, what happens when a military leader starts to question the war effort? Meet Colonel Ernst, a high-ranking German officer who had a change of heart during World War II. He was in charge of a unit that captured a massive stash of U.S. fuel, 50,000 gallons of it. This was a huge prize, enough to power their tanks and trucks for months. But as Colonel Ernst looked at the fuel, he felt a pang of doubt. He realized that if the U.S. was able to supply its troops with so much fuel, they must have a massive industrial machine behind them. Colonel Ernst started to think about the bigger picture. He knew that Germany was struggling to produce enough fuel and supplies for its own troops. They were relying on scarce resources and makeshift solutions. Meanwhile, the U.S. was churning out tanks, planes, and ships like they were going out of style. The colonel's doubts turned to despair as he understood that Germany couldn't keep up with the U.S. war machine. He felt like he was fighting a losing battle. As Colonel Ernst delved deeper into the fuel supply chain, he discovered some shocking facts. The U.S. was producing over 80 million barrels of oil per year, while Germany was struggling to produce just 10 million. The U.S. had a vast network of oil pipelines, refineries, and distribution centers, while Germany's infrastructure was limited and damaged. The colonel realized that the war was not just about soldiers and guns, but about the industrial might behind them. The colonel's story is a fascinating example of how a single event can change someone's perspective. He went from being a loyal and dedicated officer to a disillusioned and defeated man. His experience shows that even in the heat of war, people can have a moment of clarity and realize that their cause is doomed. This is a crucial insight, as it highlights the importance of understanding the broader context of a conflict. Colonel Ernst's story also raises questions about the role of logistics and supply chains in warfare. It's not just about the bravery of soldiers or the tactics of generals, but about the ability to produce and distribute resources. This is a key takeaway from the colonel's experience, and it's essential to consider this when analyzing the outcome of wars. As we look at the bigger picture, it's clear that the outcome of World War II was not just determined by battles and skirmishes, but by the underlying economic and industrial factors. The U.S. and its allies had a significant advantage in terms of production and supply chains, which ultimately contributed to their victory. This is a crucial lesson for anyone interested in history, warfare, or strategy. And it's a lesson that will become even more apparent in the next section, where we'll explore the final days of the war and the aftermath of Germany's defeat. So, what happens when a top military officer starts questioning the war effort? Meet Colonel Ludwig, a high-ranking German officer who had a change of heart during World War II. He was in charge of a large unit, and his job was to disrupt the Allied forces' supply lines. One day, his team ambushed a convoy and captured a massive stash of U.S. fuel, over 50,000 gallons. It was a huge haul and Colonel Ludwig was ecstatic. But as he looked at the fuel, he realized something strange. The Allies had so much fuel that they could afford to lose 50,000 gallons and still keep going. This got him thinking, how could Germany possibly win a war against an enemy with such vast resources? Colonel Ludwig started to notice other things too. The Allied forces had better equipment, more troops, and a stronger air force. They were like a well-oiled machine, working together seamlessly. On the other hand, the German army was struggling to keep up. They were low on supplies and morale was at an all-time low. Colonel Ludwig realized that Germany was doomed to lose the war. He felt like he was fighting a losing battle, and it was only a matter of time before the Allies won. This realization was a tough pill to swallow for Colonel Ludwig. He had always been a loyal soldier, dedicated to his country and his duty. But now he was faced with the harsh reality that Germany was on the wrong side of history. He started to question the Nazi regime and its leaders, wondering how they could have led the country down such a disastrous path. Colonel Ludwig's experience is a powerful reminder that even in the heat of war, there are moments of clarity that can change everything. The key insight here is that sometimes, it's the smallest moments that can change our perspective entirely. For Colonel Ludwig, it was the capture of 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel that made him realize the war was lost. It's a powerful reminder that we should always be open to new information and be willing to question our assumptions. As we conclude the story of Colonel Ludwig and the German war effort, it's clear that the outcome of the war was far from certain, but one thing is clear, the capture of that fuel was a turning point for Colonel Ludwig, and it's a moment that will stay with him forever. Now, let's take a closer look at how this story fits into the broader context of the war and what we can learn from it. In a stunning turn of events, a German colonel's daring heist of 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel led to a profound realization: the war was lost and Germany's fate was all but sealed. This moment of truth is a powerful reminder that even in the heat of battle, the tide of war can shift in an instant. The colonel's story teaches us that the consequences of our actions can be far-reaching, and that sometimes, it's the smallest moments that hold the greatest significance. As we reflect on this remarkable tale, it's clear that the colonel's experience was a catalyst for personal transformation. He was forced to confront the harsh reality of his situation, and in doing so, he underwent a profound shift in perspective. This transformation is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth and change, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. So, what can we learn from the colonel's story? One key takeaway is the importance of being adaptable and open to new information. The colonel's realization that Germany was doomed was a direct result of his willingness to confront the truth, no matter how difficult it may have been. So, take a moment to assess your own situation. Are there any areas where you're refusing to see the truth? Take one step today to seek out new information, to challenge your own assumptions, and to be open to the possibility of change. This video found you for a reason. Perhaps you're at a crossroads in your own life, facing a difficult decision or struggling to come to terms with a challenging situation. Whatever your circumstances, know that you're not alone, and that the stories of the past can offer valuable insights and guidance. If you found this story as compelling as I do, be sure to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. As you close this video, remember that the colonel's story is a powerful reminder that our actions have consequences, and that the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard we may try to hide from it. The colonel's transformation is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth and change, and a reminder that it's never too late to seek out new information, to challenge our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility of transformation. May his story inspire you to approach your own challenges with courage, curiosity, and a willingness to confront the truth, no matter how difficult it may be.